It's good to be here with you guys today and talking with you about some of the resistant weeds you guys are dealing with, as well as how we should be thinking about managing them, what we need to do, and a little bit what's on the horizon and to be considering as well. I don't like um, I don't like just talking. I mean, I know we got 2 hours. I'm going to try to keep it to about 40, 45 minutes and leave time for questions and back and forth after. But as I'm going, if you have a question, type it in the chat. Al will get it to my attention, or hopefully I'll see it, or just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. It won't bother me. It's not going to mess me up. So please feel free. I want this to be informative and useful for you guys. So when we talk about the resistant weeds, you guys, you're in a pretty unique situation as far as what you have, what's going on, as far as resistant weeds and different biotypes. One of the big challenges you guys have, of course, is horseweed or mare's tail, been around for a while. You guys seem to be on the front end of a lot of these things developing resistance, and I'm not exactly sure why. Doesn't seem like geography lends itself, to it. Maybe because you have a little bit more isolation, but it seems like the horseweed kind of started up in the Northeast. This common ragweed that we're seeing with resistance, and the glyphosate resistance was, south of you guys, but it came up fairly quick. And then the three-way resistance we confirmed. Palmer amaranth, of course, you guys just inherited that problem. It came along, and spread to you. The Waterhemp showed up in your area first, and now we've got some issues with red root pigweed that are showing up in your area first. So I'm going to go through each of these a little bit, and then give some general management for resistant weeds. As far as horseweed, 2,4-D works really well, cleaning up that glyphosate resistance. We do have a fair bit of ALS resistance in our horseweed populations, or mare's tail. So having a growth regulator is going to be one of our best tools. So here's an example of 2,4-D. This is a pint. Let me get my pointer up here. So you got a pint on the left and 2 pints on the right. The different colored flags are the different size horseweed at the time of application. And you'll notice that pint, it only killed the little ones, which is good to know, right? So if you have small horseweed under 6 inches tall, you're going to get them in general with the 1 pint rate. The 2 pints will help you pick up some of these that are pushing 10 inches, maybe 12 inches. But these bigger ones that are 1.5 to 2 foot tall, you're still not going to get complete control of those reliably. So we need to be timely, with our products, but also knowing what rate to be putting out. If you're saying, well, I'm going to cut a corner, use that pint rate, that's fine if you have small horseweed. But once they get some size, you have to spend that little bit extra money and go to 2 pints. Liberty and Gramoxone both work very well. You need sunny, warm days for these two to work. And generally, Liberty, it works really good, as you can see. But I'd like to be saving that for in-crop applications as much as we can. That's not to say you can't put it in a burn down. The one thing here, I think, I don't deal with prices a lot, but that Liberty, I think, would be a pretty expensive burn down program. If you don't have any other choice, it's definitely something you can do, though. Gramoxone, 3 pints, did a good job on all sizes as well. I will let you know we have found a Gramoxone resistant biotype in the state. It was isolated, and we pretty well wiped it out as far as I know. That farmer, he was no-till, 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 and then stopped no-till once we found this. But there is paraquat or Gramoxone resistant biotypes of horseweed to the north of us, up in Delaware, Ohio, Pennsylvania, maybe even Maryland, Virginia. So just know, since these come in on, on the air, we could get this traveling in from somewhere as well. Then you got the PPO Sharpen, excellent. I mean, if there was ever a horseweed product made, it's Sharpen. Just 1 ounce is pretty well death on all sizes. So this is an excellent option as well if you don't want to do the growth regulator, and you don't feel like doing the training for gramoxone. Sharpen is an excellent option. And then, I showed 2,4-D. I wanted to show this is dicamba versus straight Roundup. This is a resistant biotype. You see the Roundup alone didn't do an excellent job at all. And then we looked at different residual products to help hold this for several weeks after application. Just dicamba and Roundup, either alone or with warrant, only gave about 75% control. And then if we had the Valor in there, it bumped it up to 100%. And this is really regrowth, right? So the residual effect of that Valor is keeping a second flush of that horseweed from coming in. Now I will note, I couldn't remember if I put the slide in or not, but if you do a second application of dicamba with Roundup, you will get near 100% control at the same time frame, but that's because you're waiting for another flush of horseweed and spraying again. So keep that in mind. I don't think we should be doing that. Multiple applications of a post-emergence, that's just setting us up for down the road running into resistance issues. I think including a residual product is really the way to go for us. All right, the common ragweed, the blue is glyphosate, ALS resistance, and the orange is that 3-way resistant population we identified about 4 or 5 years ago up in your guys' neck of the woods. It's resistant to, of course, Roundup, all the ALS inhibitors that are out there, anything you can think of, whether it's Classic, Pursuit, First Rate, you name it, didn't kill it. And then the PPO inhibitors. So we're talking Cobra, Blazer, Reflex, Flexstar, Resource, all the PPO inhibitors wouldn't touch it. So that's something we need to keep in mind. I've got a whole presentation on how to control this. The big thing is we need to go to the newer technologies, that have come out. So Enlist, Extend, Liberty Link, they all will do well. The products for them. Hold on 1 second. All right, sorry about that. That was Al calling. I thought I was doing something wrong, but he got kicked off on the internet. He'll be coming back on. We'll just keep rolling. Like I said, if you have any questions, just let me know. But yeah, the Extend, Enlist, Liberty Link, right? Dicamba 2,4-D and Liberty all do an excellent job post-emergence on this ragweed. The key is getting them when they're small. If they get much over 4 inches, we start getting variable control. We'll get most of them most of the time, but we'll let some slip through. The concern is it's the same with Palmer, right? We don't want to be letting stuff slip through. So make sure we're getting them when they're small and we can effectively control them. Right now, Valor still works, gives us fair control on the ragweed. I wouldn't say it's excellent or at the same level that we normally get, but definitely something we should still be including because the ALS products don't work. Another one to think about if you don't have sandy soil is metribuzin, Sencor, Tricor. There's a number of other names now. But that one works very well on ragweed, and we don't have to worry about, jacking the rates up to get control. The labeled rates for your soil type will control the common ragweed. So keep that in mind as something to include in your program as well. Now, getting to the pigweeds, we had 3 of them on the list that I started with. Um, Palmer amaranth, of course, is our big driver weed. We got the resistance to glyphosate, ALS, and about everything we have. We're finding more and more PPO resistant biotypes across the state, and there are pockets where we have some other concerns going on as well. This is actually from up in your guys' neck of the woods. This is a situation that I had been called in to look at initially, because a pre-product had failed on the pigweed, and they had come back in and sprayed with dicamba to take it out. They didn't want to deal with it and worry about it, let it get too big. And you can see pretty clearly how small these plants are, and that dicamba did not control them. Now, it wasn't all the plants in the field, which is one of the things that makes it concerning, right? This is another thing I want to point out. Spraying these weeds when they're too big, when they got some size to them, we're not going to get effective control, and we're going to set ourselves up for trouble, right? We got some that are dead, but we have a number that are still alive. Oftentimes, these will curl back up and continue to grow. And there's a lot more Palmer amaranth problems starting. I really didn't get a chance to get up there last year because of the COVID restrictions for us. Hopefully this year I'll be able to get out and do some more looking around and finding stuff. This is from a couple years ago. Found some fields, actually got called up to look at some fields, and found situations like this where they had survived. Now, this is Palmer amaranth, right? Survived glyphosate, ALS, and PPO. So we're working on trying to confirm that PPO resistance in your part of the state. Pretty sure it is, just looking at what's happening and the symptoms. The concern is, this is one of my concerns. Like, some of the stuff like is right next door, to where some potatoes are being grown, right? And in the potatoes, they look like they were surviving from the field history I could get. They're surviving metribuzin as well. My worry is that we could be, selecting for metribuzin or PS2 resistance on top of it. So we're going to do some testing on it. We've collected plants and seeds from these different populations in different fields. Basically, I just kind of rode around out in the desert and some of the other parts just to see what was all going on, and tried to find plants and then tried to figure out what was going on from it. So we're going to be doing some work. Like I said, we got that stuff that survived that dicamba that I think that may have been weather related, but we need to get testing on that. And then the stuff that survives some of the metribuzin and ALS, as well as PPO in the different crops up there. So keep in mind that these are things you guys need to be watching out for as well. It's pretty easy for stuff to move around and get picked up from one area to the other. And here's the example, the potatoes, where you got a number of Palmer plants living in those as well. Not because they weren't sprayed, but I think because we probably have resistance going on, right? We already know we have some PPO resistance, we have ALS resistance, and in potatoes, post-emergence, you have 2 products, and there is triazine resistant, atrazine resistant Palmer amaranth we found in the state down in the Blacklands. I doubt that picked up and moved. It just tells me, well, and other states have reported it as well. So we know we can select for resistance there also. So just something we need to be aware of and thinking of. Like I said, we're working on this confirmation of that atrazine stuff. It's surviving 2 pounds post emergence in the greenhouse. So we're trying to wrap that up to officially confirm it as well. Now the common water hemp, it first showed up in your part of the state again about 6 years ago, about the same time as that common ragweed we found. Um, it's similar to Palmer amaranth. It's got male and female plants. It's got a hairless stem, like you can see here. The big difference is the shape of the leaf. It's not nearly as aggressive growing. It doesn't get as big as fast, but leaf shape will tell it apart. It's a lot longer and thinner, a little bit more of a spearhead shape versus an egg shape like we see with the Palmer. You can see this petiole where that leaf attaches to the stem is much shorter than with the Palmer amaranth. And then, it's got a general glossier look to the leaf compared to the Palmer. Here's a picture of the one from up there in your part of the state. You can see how long and thin that leaf is, how short that petiole is. It just looks different in general, right? And this, we figured out, came in on a piece of equipment from the Midwest. The guy had bought a combine used out of Southern Illinois, and that's kind of ground zero for a lot of this water hemp issues. So looking at Palmer amaranth in the black, this is where we know we have PPO resistance, and really pretty sure we can start adding you guys onto this. We're right there. You got enough fields where it's surviving the PPO inhibitors that pretty well could start including that. We're not widespread resistance, which is good. I mean, it's just spotty. It's in pockets right now. So be aware that, you can still use your PPO inhibitors, but you need to be switching things up right now. The yellow circles are the water hemp, and you guys have it in your part of the state. And there's some out here in the north central or northwest part of the state as well. When we've been looking at these water hemp populations, what we're seeing is multiple resistance. So we inherited resistance issues with this water hemp. It wasn't selected for here. As far as I know, we hadn't had water hemp before, we first found it there in 2015. So it's ALS and glyphosate resistant, every population we've tested, BPO resistant, and triazine resistant. So it's at least 4-way resistant, everything we've looked at. And then in several populations, it's also suspected with HPPD. It's really rate dependent, and that's a metabolism based resistance. So it's only going to get worse, so to speak. So we will and pretty well do have HPPD resistance in our populations. So you think about that, having a 5-way resistant water hemp in the state means when you look at this, right, you can't spray your ALS inhibitors, your PPOs, glyphosate. You can't use atrazine or metribuzin in corn or beans. You're not going to be able to use like your Halex, Laudis, Caprino, Armazon, Impact, Callisto. They're all out. They aren't going to do anything on this. So we're down to pretty much only the growth regulators and Liberty. So keep in mind, we don't want this to continue to spread and become a bigger problem. Again, it's just fairly isolated fields and small pockets, but I feel like I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't let you know it was out there. Now the red root pigweed. Again, we've got some resistance going on here. Again, you guys and the same region up here in that north central part of the state. For you guys, you've got a PPO and ALS resistant populations of red root pigweed. And it's pretty well been selected for in conventional systems where you're not using the Roundup, the Liberty, any of the GMOs, and pretty sure it was concurrent selection, right, where we got resistance to the ALS inhibitors. ALS resistant red root pigweed's been around for a while, but now the PPO resistance is a pretty novel issue and is something that we're just starting to see. So keep in mind, if you're in a conventional system, to watch out for this. We can control it with Roundup, Liberty, the auxins. So we have options, but if you're in a conventional bean or in an alternative crop where you don't have those as options, it's gonna you're gonna run into difficulty. Now, I have the glyphosate resistant with a question mark, not for your guys' populations. We haven't seen that, but over here we have a population that has been surviving Roundup in the field. But when we get it to the greenhouse, we can kill it dead pretty consistently. So we're not sure what's going on there. I mean, we can put 2 and 4x rates on in the field, and then we bring it to the greenhouse and it dies. So we're still trying to figure that business out. But we do know the PPO ALS resistance. I just include the glyphosate resistant part because it seems like we're on the path of selecting for resistance there, at least on some level. To manage this resistance, it really kind of doesn't matter what we're talking about, right? Whether it's horseweed, ragweed, or the pigweeds, we need to use multiple modes of action, and we need to use those residual herbicides. You're talking about, you guys have 3 different species with at least 3-way resistance, and some of them might be 4 or 5-way resistant, right? So we can't rely on one mode of action and carry it out until it breaks. We've got to be rotating these chemistries. We have to be trying to delay resistance to any other of our mode of actions. So use your residual herbicides, your group 15s, the dual, warrant, outlook, Ziduas. They're going to do a good job on everything but the ragweed. They'll do okay on the ragweed, but they're not going to be something you jump up and down and say, man, this was awesome. They'll hold back a little bit, but it's not going to be amazing. So including them won't hurt. It's going to pick up your other weeds anyway, your grasses and small seeded broadleaves. The group 14s still have a place. Even though we found resistance post to the PPOs, so far we can still get some control. It might be reduced control with these group 14s, but until we can get new modes of action on the market, this is kind of what we're left with, right? So go ahead and include the Valor and the reflexes for all of these. The Spartan products, the Authority products, aren't as good on ragweed. It's just the chemistry isn't strong on ragweed, so keep that in mind. They're good, they're great on pigweeds, but the Valor and Reflex, or so prefix, would be your better options where you have the common ragweed as a problem. And then metribuzin, again, for all of these weeds, is going to be a good option for you guys. We are looking into that, trizine resistant Palmer Amaranth. Hopefully we don't find resistance there. But anyway, it's still good to include it to try to help take some pressure off of those PPOs and others. Now, our post products, our new GMOs, right? The Enlist, Extend, or Extendamax, and Liberty all do a good job on these species I'm talking about. There's different strengths and weaknesses. All 3 of these are very good on the horseweed and the common ragweed, as well as our red root pigweed. Palmer Amaranth, Waterhemp, we can run into issues once we get over 3 or 4 inch weeds. Okay. And so keep in mind, we don't want to let them get too big before we control them. So using our residual products with these post products will give us some flexibility. With as much rain as we've been having, it's been so hard to get back in a timely window to get these posts back on. So having that pre will give you that chance of getting in on smaller weeds. Now, there's a lot of traits out there now. And we didn't ever have to really worry about this with soybeans. It was just, Roundup ready or not Roundup ready. And then we got Liberty Link, and that wasn't too bad. But now we're starting to get more and more stacked traits. And so I wanted to put together this table for you to kind of hopefully get things straight and kind of organize it a little bit. So you got your conventional beans that obviously you can't spray any of these herbicides on or you'll kill them. Then we had our Roundup Ready 2s, Liberty Link, and then about 5 years ago, we had our first stack traits, right? The Roundup Ready 2 Extend, you got glyphosate and dicamba tolerance in those. Then Enlist E3 came along. That's our first three-way stack, right? Glyphosate, Liberty, and 2,4-D. And then in the last few years, and this year especially, we have a couple new three-way stacks. You got you had the GT27s and the LLGT27s. So what these are tolerant to the glyphosate and HPPD, but the HPPD was not approved for export until just this last year. So they never really advertised this 27 piece, the HPPDs, only the glyphosate. So you just saw them as typical Roundup Ready beans. Going forward, we'll be able to apply the HPPDs on these, and it's going to primarily be a pre-emergence application. The LLGTs, you saw these on the market the last year or two. That's got Liberty and glyphosate and HPPD in them. So we do have these options. And now the most recent approval is the Extend Flex, where we can do glyphosate, Liberty, and dicamba. Really what it's going to boil down to, for the most part, we'll be seeing these three-way stacks, either the Enlist E3, the LLGT27s, or Extend Flex. We can do Roundup and Liberty. And then the third one, the kicker, will either be the 2,4-D, the HPPD, or the dicamba. So we just have to be aware of which extra trait we have in there. Most of the stuff, unless it's a straight Roundup Ready or Liberty Link, we'll be able to spray either Roundup or Liberty on them. So keep these straight. If you get a spray across the field, that's not tolerant to any of these, you're going to kill them. So make sure you know where you're planting your specific traits. Consider flagging your fields so that, as you go into spray, what technology's in there. But at the very least, just, keep them squared away, because that's a significant issue if you do spray them wrong. All right, specific programs, if we're going to dig in a little bit, like on the pigweeds, the Palmer Amaranth, we really got to be talking to that strong pre, that Valor Metribuzin and a Group 15. If we can do premixes, that's great. Most of our Palmer and the Ragweed and, even the Waterhemp and a lot of the red root are resistant to the ALS inhibitors. So our Pursuit, Classic Harmonies, they're not going to be as effective for us. But excuse me. But something to consider if you are in a area where you don't have these weeds, or you have, let's say, sickle pod or cocklebur or some other weeds, you still might want to be including these ALS inhibitors to pick them up. They do a good job, maybe a better job on some of these other less common weeds or not resistant weeds. Continue to use your PPO inhibitors. They still work in most areas. Just be rotating them in or using them as supplements to your different traits and herbicide technologies. What my concern is, I don't want to see folks picking a technology and saying, I'm going to use this until it breaks. I'm all right spraying. I'm just going to pick Liberty. Let's say I'm going to pick Liberty and I'm going to spray it until it doesn't work anymore. All right. That could be a viable option. I mean, you might get 5 or 6, maybe 7 years out of it, who knows. But the problem is once you break it and you say, well, I'll just switch to one of the other technologies, in the meantime, somebody else down the road might have said, I'm picking Enlist, and another guy down the road picked the Extend, and you guys all work to, basically break them and create resistance concurrently. And we know the pollen flows and spreads the resistance. So you end up creating this just terrible situation where nothing ends up working. So we all have to work together by mixing our chemistries to avoid having those issues later on. Now, it's not just about controlling soybeans. Actually, soybeans are one of our toughest crops to control our pigweeds and our other weeds in, right? We do have good technologies now, but here's a good example back when we had Roundup resistant Palmer just taking over the world. Okay, so right here, this whole field, the time of this picture was 2009. This whole field was treated the same, right? Where this is Dr. York's picture, right? He was standing here in this clean field and taking a picture across this weedy field. And at the time, he didn't know what happened, but he said there was just a straight line down the field where it was clean and it was messy. He thought it might have been two different farmers, and so he was trying to figure out what was going on. Well, it turned out, excuse me, this was soybean in 2008, so it was bean. This was tobacco the year before. Now, there's nothing magical about tobacco and why this would be clean, but the only difference is tobacco is a high labor crop, right? They go through and they hand weed to take out any of the escapes to keep them, from competing with the tobacco. Any competition's bad for tobacco. You're going for optimal leaf size, and in any competition is going to decrease your product, right? And so they went through and hand weeded this part of the field the year before. They didn't do that over here because it was soybean. So just 1 year of hand weeding cleaned up this side of the field considerably compared to the other, right? Now, there's other studies we've done in the state. This one was also done here in North Carolina's Johnston County. Set up a study with a farmer, basically just split one field in half. And what he had was cotton. Previously, I think he had a couple years of cotton, and it was a bad Palmer field. It was really weedy. So they set it up doing soybeans on one half and sorghum on the other. Just manage it. He did all the work just like he normally would for either crop. Came back and double cropped wheat in over the winter, and then did soybeans the following year to see what it looked like, in that soybean year. This is after wheat harvest. This is the side that had the grain sorghum. This is the side that had the soybean. You can't tell me that there isn't a clear difference on being able to keep that crop clean the year before. Whether this is corn or any other crop, be it tobacco, you name it, right? If you keep that Palmer, that ragweed, that horseweed from going to seed, you're going to have a better field to manage the following year. Just letting some of these go to seed is going to be an issue. Now, grain sorghum does have some allelopathic properties, so it does have a herbicidal effect just growing in the field. That's part of why I was pushing it hard for a couple of years there. I think it has a lot of benefits for weed control as well. Got a frog in my throat today. I apologize for that. Hopefully, hopefully it clears up here. Um, But there are things, we can take away from this, right? Having a clean field, especially for our palmer, even 1 year takes out all these weeds that are going to be coming up the following year and takes that selection pressure off of our herbicides, right? So whether we're hand weeding it, whether we're going to a crop that's more, we have better control, or we're doing post harvest control in the case of corn, coming back with some gramoxone after corn harvest, we always get a flush of palmer in those fields, and they can produce a lot of seed in a short amount of time. We come in and we clean those up, it's going to put us in a good situation. This is a picture from the combine when he went ahead and was harvesting this. This is where it was the soybean, so cotton, soybean, wheat, soybean, versus where the sorghum was. This is from the year before. So this was all treated the same across that whole field in the year that these pictures were taken. Once that wheat was off, he didn't do anything different on the two sides. And this is the difference in yield. Now, some of this had to do with nematodes, and cleaning those up, but a lot of it had to do with taking that palmer out. And just, looking at those fields, you could see just the other weeds that weren't present as well. And then he saw a 2.5-fold increase in yield. Now, clearly this isn't high yielding bean ground, this is kind of the sand that holds the world together that goes down the coastal plain. But for this guy, the difference between 11 bushels and 27 bushels, it was worth that, switching it up, especially all he did was went to grain sorghum. So it's not like he was losing money out of the deal. He didn't do anything special. He just grew a different crop in there. Now, another thing to think about, I've talked a lot about these residual products. I stress the need for them and how we should be using them. We've been having some complaints and some concerns the last few years about pre-emergence herbicide injury on our crops. We've seen some stunted plants, deformed leaves. There's been some question of, are we getting stand loss? And then always with it is the question, is there a yield loss on the back end? So I want to walk through some of these reasons for having this injury, what's happening, how they occur, and then a little bit about what we can do or what we should do going forward. Generally, if we're going to see herbicide injury, it's going to be because we have a rate that's off or environmental conditions that affect the plant. Now, the rate, before all our guidance stuff, we would often see sprayer overlaps, either crossing up on the boom, or counting the rows wrong and getting like a double shot some areas or missing in others. We don't see that as much, although I know some folks still like having that overlap at the end of the boom just to make sure they're not leaving streaks of weeds down the field. It can occur from soil movement, through erosion and moving it into different parts of the field, or even just leaching and lateral movement with surface water as well. Environmental conditions that affect our herbicide injury part are typically going to be either cool weather or wet weather and excessive moisture. And you guys know as well as I do, these last few years have just been wet. You walk outside and when water squishes up around your feet, you just know there's too much there. So either one of these can cause an issue for herbicide metabolism. The two of them together are a recipe for disaster. Now, I want to point out, these herbicides that we use pre-emergence have never been, let's just say, completely safe on most, for the most part, right? Especially on soybeans. In corn, you can put a pile of atrazine on corn and not see any effects. There's some cases like that where you just have true tolerance to whatever you want to put on. But in soybeans, we've always had this dance of how much can I put out versus how much will I injure my soybeans? And that's why Roundup Ready just took off like wildfire, right? Because it was the easy button on weed control, and your beans looked awesome all year, right? You never had these funny looking beans from the Roundup, because everything we were putting on before Roundup caused some sort of soybean response. So once we got into Roundup Ready and we're using more of these residual products again, we're relearning what these symptoms can be. So, for our ALS inhibitors or classic, for example, we can get leaf distortion, some puckered up leaves. Here's some folded leaves. You can get leaf discoloration, red veins, purple veins, stacked nodes. This is actually carryover from finesse, but it's similar to symptoms we can see with classic or some of the other SU herbicides, the ALS herbicides, where if you count these nodes going up this healthy plant, right, it's got about the same number of nodes as this stacked up dinky little stunted plant, right? So what it does is it doesn't allow that plant to elongate like it should. It stacks up these nodes, and that plant struggles, right? It doesn't have the same leaf area. It doesn't have the same photosynthetic potential to generate photosynthate and sugar and grow and do everything you want it to do, right? So these stunted plants look ugly, and you're not going to be happy with them. And you can get this from having carryover from a herbicide that the soybeans can't tolerate, but you can also get this under bad weather conditions, right? Or less than ideal growing conditions. Now, it's not just the ALS inhibitors. Here's the chloracetamides, the group 15s. Now, obviously, this is corn, but this is buggy whipping it. You guys grow a fair bit of corn up in your part of the state. You guys probably have seen this at some point, right? Where that tip of the leaf gets trapped in the whorl and it doesn't open up correctly. So you get a little bit of deformed leaves, that buggy whipping look. On soybean, we get the drawstring effect. Looks like somebody grabbed that mid vein and just pulled down and pulled in the top like a drawstring, a heart-shaped leaf, we often call it. This is common, especially on the first trifoliate after a pre. Again, cool, wet conditions often cause this. You'll notice you can get some of this puckering and almost cupping of the leaf as well. We can have issues from the chloracetamides. This is actually cotton, generally in soybeans, unless you just pick the wrong chlorocetamide to put out. We don't see big issues like this, but this was a situation with cotton where there's some standing water kind of concentrated it, and it ended up getting too high of a rate. But post-emergence, we can see, I didn't have a soybean picture, but this shows the same thing. You can get some puckered up leaves, some surfactant burn post-emergence from the chloracetamides as well. So if you're putting out the dual, the warrants, this is typical. This isn't anything, at least from my perspective, that I would freak out about. I realize when you put out something, you don't want to see that, and it often makes your stomach feel bad for a day or two. Hopefully that's it, and the plant continues growing. Metribuzin, I've talked a bunch about this, right? Depending on what variety of soybeans you put out and what type of soil you have, the rate of metribuzin you use, you can go anywhere from a little bit of leaf burn, some yellowing on the leaves, all the way to complete death due to metribuzin. So you really have to be careful with this one. Heavier soils, you got a lot more flexibility, but you still want to pick a tolerant variety. And the PPO inhibitors, we can still have some issues with them as well. This was a situation where we had Valor. It was a heavy rain. You can just see, where that soil been rained hard on. It was a lighter soil, but generally what happens is you get splash up of that herbicide onto that growing point, and a lot of times it can kill it. In this case, it made it look pretty sick. These plants may not make it. We've seen some significant stand loss from situations like this, but in 2020, 21 years of doing this, since I was in graduate school, I've only seen this happen maybe 3 times, right? So this is very rare. And that's the balance, right? You have a little bit of risk and a lot of reward, and you do this dance. Now, I showed you every pre-herbicide I talked about you should be using can cause injury on our soybeans. It's not to scare you away from using these pre's. It's to let you know that these can happen. And generally, when we look at it, it's because of the environment. It's not necessarily the herbicide. Okay. If we have cool or wet weather, either one, what it does is it slows down the plant, right? So if we had soybeans outside today, wouldn't be good because it'd be way too cold, but it's cool and wet out. And so that cool, wet, both act in harmony to slow down that soybeans growth. It's got less growth, so it has less opportunity to metabolize or break down these herbicides. That's how these plants, our crops, tolerate these herbicides in most cases, is they metabolize or break them down inside into not toxic compounds and then continue to grow. If that soybean plant isn't actively growing, it can't actively break down these herbicides. So what you end up with is a more concentrated form of that herbicide in there that then causes more of a response. That soybean can't detoxify it. Shoot, think of it, you know, in terms of even us, right? Breaking things down, whether it's caffeine or medicine, or, if you drink from time to time, when you're younger and you're actively growing and you had a better metabolism, you could, recover from having a drink or two a lot quicker than you can as you get older. I'm figuring that out. So that slowed metabolism, it it affects your response and the ability to respond to those outside toxins, right? So having that slowed metabolism makes that herbicide express itself more. Generally, once the weather turns and gets better, it dries out a little bit or it warms up a little bit, that plant starts growing again, starts breaking down that herbicide, and then outgrows that injury with better weather. And for soybeans especially, we have a lot of plasticity in our growth, and most of our yield is all put on the back end. So as long as they can come out of it and start growing well, and you get new leaves, new growth, and everything looks good, we typically, I haven't really seen many cases of stand loss at all, like stand loss period, and very, very rarely have I seen yield effects due to pre-herbicides. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, if that weather is bad enough that it affects your stand that you need a replant, the herbicide's not going to help it recover, but your primary issue is the weather. So how do we minimize these issues, right? So we want to avoid making any applications right before a lot of rainfall. Reduces that chance of erosion and splash up. You don't want stuff leached right down into the roots or pushed right into the furrow. But one of the big things, I hear a lot of folks say, well, I think I'm just going to cut that rate, right? I'm not going to put as much out so I don't see as much injury. And all caps, do not cut the rate. I'll be up front. If you cut the rate, you're going to see less injury, right? There's not two ways around it. But what it does is it reduces the herbicide dose that the weeds are getting. Also, you cut down that dose of that herbicide, there's greater potential for the weeds to survive that herbicide as well. And what we're just doing is we're setting ourselves up to creep towards resistance. And we don't need to be doing that, because oftentimes these residual products we're talking about are our last line of defense for resistance management. Okay. And if you think about cutting the rate, just go ahead and don't put it out. I think it's a bad idea, because we don't need to continue this treadmill of burning up post-emergence herbicides, but we need to preserve these residuals as well. I think we should be putting them out and just saying, okay, conditions we need to watch and know where to apply them, where not to. Sometimes if it's really wet, maybe you don't put a pre out at planting. Maybe you put a residual out with your first post and just plan to come back early. There's ways we can get around it. Just don't be cutting that rate. All right, the last little bit I'm going to talk about is moisture gradient tank. Some moisture work we've been doing, looking at competition and weeds. We're just getting started with this work. We've done a couple different studies, and I think it's pretty interesting. And hopefully, there's definitely some take homes from this. But we built these tanks or boxes out of wood, right? They're 4 foot wide and 8 foot long, basically a sheet of plywood, roughly on the ground there as a footprint. What we do is we line it with a pool liner and fill it with field soil, but with a gravel layer on the bottom. We got this standpipe coming in the back where we bring in water so it sub irrigates everything. And then we have a little standpipe here that lets the water flow out. What we do is we create a water table in here. And with this sloped surface, you get everything from saturated soils to very droughty soils. It looks like this. Here would be our capillary fringe. You can see with no plants in there, that water coming up, part of the way, about a quarter of the way up that tank. And so you get wet soils all the way up to very dry soils, and then a mixture in between. So you get this varying water table depth and different moisture response. What we did is we set these up. We planted soybean, Palmer amaranth, and large crabgrass in here in different combinations. We watered them over the top with this drip tape until the soybeans got to V3. And then we turned off. Well, we didn't completely turn it off, but we stopped watering. We only watered every other day so that we created that drought stress, that drought response on these upper levels of that tank. And we wanted to see what happened for 3 weeks of competition, and then measured about everything you could, heights, weights, leaf number, tillers on the crabgrass. We dug up the roots and we measured all of that. And I could do an hour talk on this alone, but I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. Okay. So that tank is up here in the top right corner, right? So as we go up this slope, this is from 1 to 9. It's the same as these down here. As you go left to right, you're increasing the moisture stress. There's more drought stress. So when we look at the height of the soybean growing on its own, that's the open circles here. You can see as we introduce drought stress, less water, the heights of the soybean go down. Same with the weights, leaf number. In general, that was the response, what we would expect, right? The crabgrass reduced those soybean heights even more under the dry conditions. So where there was adequate moisture, the soybeans grew about the same, whether they were grown alone or in competition with the crabgrass. But once you got into more drought, they affected the soybean growth more, which again, not a big surprise. Generally, that happens with competition. The surprise was that where they were growing in competition with the Palmer amaranth, all these triangles, they were all taller, significantly taller than the soybeans growing alone or with the crabgrass. We still saw the same trend in reduced heights as there was less water available. But why were these soybeans taller? They were essentially trying to outgrow the Palmer. This is one of the tanks that's got the soybeans and the Palmer. If you look over here on the side, you can see the soybean trifoliate. It's kind of poking out, gasping for life. There's 1 or 2 in the middle you can see, but basically these Palmer just took off and said, let's go, we're off to the races. And the soybean tried to keep up, but man, they were struggling. In fact, we look at the biomass. This was interesting, right? So the soybean grown alone had the highest biomass average across all our moisture gradients. Where it was grown in competition with the Palmer, it was less, but not statistically different. because they tried to, they had so much more height, they just weren't putting on equivalent biomass. So they were taller, but they weighed less. What was surprising, even though we didn't see big differences in heights with the large crabgrass competition, we did see significant differences with that shoot dry biomass. So there was one crabgrass to one soybean in those boxes. Same with the Palmer, it was 1-to-1 competition. We saw a significant reduction in the biomass of those soybean grown in competition in that moisture gradient for just 3 weeks with that crabgrass. So it was interesting to see that impact that just even a single crabgrass plant could have there. Now, looking at the Palmer Amaranth, there's some other things to unpack here. First of all, this weed is phenomenal, right? This student is the one that worked on this. These boxes are about 6 foot tall. He's about 6 foot tall. That Palmer was cut off at the soil surface, grew over 6 foot in that time frame. That root looks more like a carrot than anything else. And these are these tanks, right? So that's 4 foot wide, going back to 6 foot tall in the back. But look how tall these Palmer are. They even outgrew the lights. That's the light for this. They just man, they love this setup. The only thing that was significantly affected by the moisture gradient in this was the root length of Palmer. Heights, biomass, leaf number, all of that were not affected, only root length. And what happened, the roots got longer as the depth to the water table increased. Essentially, that Palmer grew to where the water was. And so even these way up here at the top that had like 2.5 feet to go, 3 feet to go to get to the water, they made it down to that water. Now, there was a similar trend for the other, species, the soybean and the crabgrass, but they didn't reach the water table. They couldn't grow that far that fast. Only the Palmer was. And that surprised me. I did not expect the Palmer to be able to grow down to there. But another piece that's, so that says, look, it knows I'm in a droughty situation, right? It says, I know I need to find water. And so it puts energy towards that root growth. So it can respond to moisture stress, but it's also responding to competition. And this is the root length of the Palmer growing alone. This is just average across them, right? So about 45 centimeters. But when we had soybean or crabgrass growing in competition with the Palmer, the roots were longer. So it knew there was a plant there to compete with, and they grew another 10 centimeters or 5 inches on average longer just because those other plants were present. So this tells me that Palmer, this is all new. We just finished this stuff, last fall. I'm still trying to figure this all out. We want to do more work with this, but what it seems like is going on, this Palmer identifies, I'm giving it brains. It doesn't have brains, but there's signals that it's reading, right? That says, I have drought stress. I need to send growth to my roots. They need to get longer. It says, it signals there are other plants nearby, other species nearby. I need to increase my growth. And that's what's happening. So in the past, we used to say if it's droughty, it's dry, the plants probably aren't growing. Maybe you don't want to bother spraying to kill your weeds. This kind of turns that on its head and says, maybe we should be thinking about killing this Palmer no matter what. You look at these roots, this is down here at the bottom of the box or the tank, that shallow water table. Look how shallow these roots are. As we go up that slope and the deeper water table, look how much longer these roots get. Those roots are huge. These are 2.5, 3 foot long roots. It's quite impressive how this responded. And these were all planted the same time. They were in the same box together. So they all grew the same. under all the same conditions. They just responded to their own individual environment. So the take-home message across all this is we got to be on time to kill these weeds. Use our rates wisely, mix up our modes of action, rotate chemistries, keep stuff from going to seed if we can. Because gosh, this is only going to get worse if we don't be more proactive on the front end. And more, as I look at this data, I think regardless of weather, we need to make sure we're getting these weeds controlled early. We don't need these pigweeds. And I haven't even looked at ragweed and the others in these boxes or tanks yet. So we need to be making sure we get these weeds out to give the soybeans the best chance for growth that we possibly can. So that's it. That's what I got for presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm gonna stop this. Al, did you get back on?
Yep, sure did. We had
right.
a power surge, so it knocked us out for a few minutes. Question comes to my mind, Dr. Everman, not that I want to steal the floor because I want to hear other people's questions. So if you have got fields with a major problem, and I'm thinking about, especially now, with people going to this early planted, early matured, or whether you do earlier planting, to take advantage of those long days of summer, would it might be that in those cases, maybe those fields where you've really got a problem, again, it goes back to this idea, cool, wet soils, that if you really got a problem, trying to just stay away from a situation whether it's wetter or it's the time of year so it's cooler and wetter, any of those things we can avoid where we've got really serious problems. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's something we're gonna have to. I'm probably gonna have to sit down with Rachel, and we're gonna have to come up with some experiments to look at, because the earlier we plant, there's a whole other set of things. You can talk to Dominic and Lindsay about other issues, especially Lindsay, on seedling diseases when it's cool and wet. That's often a compounding issue on top of the herbicides and whatnot, right? So the cool wet weather slows down your soybean plant. If there's the pre-herbicides, that can slow them down a little bit more, right? You can see the injury symptoms, and then those seedling diseases can jump on them as well. They're not able to fight them off as easily. So we do need to be looking at our environment and what's going on in the micro environment, even the macro environment, to say what factors do we need to be accounting for, and what I would say off the top of my head, right, if you're gonna be going early, you want it in a well-drained field, right, to help avoid having those moisture issues like too much moisture. You want a seed treatment on there for your diseases. I don't know insects. I don't think in cool, wet weather we have that many issues with insects. But then on the herbicide side, you might want to be looking at, like you were saying, maybe not putting it in your worst fields where you have a lot of weed issues, or have a plan on how you're going to handle those weeds. So if it's a wet spring, and it's cool and wet when you're planting, you don't want to add any more stress to those beans than you have to, right? So maybe you don't put that pre-herbicide out, but you need to be ready for an early post. And I would say include a residual there so that you can come in and clean it up quick. There are some options. I showed that Valor injury. I don't want people to freak out and not spray Valor. There's a reason we spray so much Valor in the state. It's generally safe for us. Like I said, 3 times in 20 years, I can't even tell you how many. Probably, it's hundreds of thousands of acres I've seen, and I've seen it happen 3 times, right? It's not like it's, man, I saw that 20 times last year. So Valor's still going to be a pretty safe product. Dual warrant Zidua are still going to be safe, pretty safe products, and they're not going to be an issue most years. It's just showing that you need to be aware that these things can happen. So I would still probably be doing a Valor premix out on those fields to try to keep most of the weeds back, even if it was a wet year, because the benefits of that flexibility on your post spray are so much greater than the potential risks from injury. So I still think we keep that pre out. But if you're uncertain, you can go without a pre if you have the right technologies that you can come in post. I would only do it in a field where I had a triple stack trait, so I could do Liberty and one of the auxins, post, and mix those up and try to come in and clean them up in a sequential spray, but include a residual product in there in the post spray to try to help hold back some of those other weeds. It's a long-winded answer, but I felt like there's a lot of facets to it, and every person's going to have to figure out what works best for their setup and their operation, because some people, have a better chance of getting over those acres early, and other people are better set up to get over them post emergence.
Are there questions from the group? While people are waiting to think of a question, the other one I had thought of, Dr. Everman, and I talked with you about this yesterday. I know there's thousands of dollars being spent on hand removal, especially late in this. They do a pretty good job, then you still have those late season survivors of these herbicide resistant weeds. What's your feelings about that investment? I mean, and what could possibly be the implications as far as in future crops in that field, especially soybeans?
Yeah, and I think you were off of the call when I was showing some of that data where I think it's worth the investment. If you have, I'll throw a caveat on there, that if you have the available labor at a reasonable price. Everything comes down to economics, but that hand weeding makes a huge difference on the return of seed back to the soil and the control measures you have to use in subsequent years. A year or two of hand weeding or late season cleanup will make huge differences in the amount of pigweeds you have to clean up in the following years. I think that's true with ragweed as well. Generally, it's a larger seed than the pigweed, but it's still, not one of our big seeds like cocklebur or velvet leaf and some of those others. So they'll live a little bit longer in the soil than the palmer does, but still fairly short-lived. So if we can reduce the return of seed to the soil for a few years, it reduces the number of plants that can come up and be an issue for us in the future. And then it's just a numbers game, because resistance is 1 in a million or 1 in a billion, whatever it is. Since these plants are so prolific in producing seeds, one palmer plant can produce 500,000 seeds, right? So that's 10 plants per square foot over a whole acre. Now, if you have, and that's just one plant per acre producing 10 per square foot over an acre for the next year. If you allow 20 or 30 per acre to survive, you think of all the numbers that are increasing, then they're getting sprayed with those herbicides the next year or two. And that's where our resistance comes from, is we're selecting for the ones that survive. So if we can reduce the number of seeds in the soil, we reduce that chance for selecting for resistance in our remaining herbicides. So it pays off economically in the short term. By you don't have to spend as much on herbicides in the next couple of years, but in the long term, it definitely pays off in more intangible ways, but definitely economically as well.
Dr. Everman, could you just for a second sort of, and I don't know if you did this during while I was off, some of the telltale signs for the presence of resistant weeds in your fields. Could you go over some of those sort of red flag situations?
Yeah. Really the classic, you know, I guess, um, indicators you might have some resistance going on in your field. First off is you got plants that are alive right next to plants that are dead of the same species. So they're sitting side by side. You killed some, but not all of them. Only one species is alive and not multiple. So it's not a rate issue. It's not a sprayer skip, something like that. And then generally it'll be a patchy area in the field if it's early on in the resistance. So you'll have, something about the size of maybe your truck or you know a small building right in the field where the plants are surviving and everything else is killed except for these small patches spaced around the field. Often will start in one part of the field and then spread to the rest. Those are the big differences. Sometimes it has to do with plants partially killed, completely killed, that going on. But if you see live plants and dead plants right beside each other of the same species, that's usually a really strong um, red flag that you need to be getting Al out there and looking at it.
Other thing that is pointed out in some of our trainings too is that if you have suspicion of resistance, if you do make a spray, and it's pretty important when you say to check, I would say within a week. That way you can be certain whether it was, if you do it a month later, you don't know if it was new stuff that came up, but if you do it like a week or 10 days, what's your feelings about that? Especially if you suspect resistance in a field.
Yeah, usually within 2 weeks, you can tell. It just depends on the chemistry. With Roundup, it was definitely like a week to 10 days. Um, you, for growth regulators, that should probably be true. Definitely true with Liberty. But if it's ALS products or some of the others, it might be a little bit longer. But usually at about 2 weeks time, 10 days to 2 weeks, you can tell, if what was sprayed is dead versus something new came up. You can tell, the difference between those. But that's a good time frame. We should be scouting after we spray just to see how effective we were, and then, like you said, if we suspect resistance, we can identify that early and still have time. I guess the week to 10 days would give you time to come back with something else and try to take it back out. If you're waiting 2 weeks, it might be too late. So a little bit earlier wouldn't hurt, at least to try to see the symptoms and see what's going on.
What about if I know that a lot of these situations have been where growers have said, hey, I've got something going on out here. If someone in our part of the world sees something that they think is not right, would you be interested in hearing about that?
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, that's part of the reason I think that's part of the reason why I do see these issues up in your part of the state, because you guys do get in touch with us pretty quick.